Hey there, Jim Johnson here for Accent Help, and I want to bring up three terms with you that are going to sound a little bit complicated, but I think they're actually useful terms for thinking about it. It's less important that you actually remember them and just really be more conscious of the concepts that they're trying to represent. So you're probably familiar with accent and dialect, and I've talked about those and how they have a couple of different definitions. I prefer the definition where accent represents the way a person speaks, and dialect talks about the word usage and phrasing and things like that. Whereas some people prefer to think of accent as strictly a foreign language accent, trying to speak a second language, or a third, or a fourth, and that dialect is somebody speaking their native language. I actually prefer the one where we think of accent is all of them, but what are the sounds? What's the musicality and all of that? Well, three other terms that are less familiar than that I want to make mention of are Acrolect, Basilect, and Mesolect. So Acrolect, A-C-R-O, Basa, B-A-S-I, and Meso, M-E-S-O, or Mesolect, right? So lect at the end of it, sort of like dialect. So the difference between these is that acrolect tends to be assigned to something that people or an individual views as sort of the desirable accent to have. Whereas a basilect is the broader accent, is the stronger. Usually it's attached to working class accents. Whereas the ones that are acrolect are oftentimes looked at as, oh, well, those are the people with a lot of money. Those are the people who have power. Those are the people who have the fancy way of speaking who have no accent, which is BS, right? Everybody has an accent. It's all about what kind of an accent do you have. Then the mesolect is in the land in between. The reality is most people speak with a mesolect. There's usually not that many who actually speak with the acrolect, depending on how broad or how narrow your definition of that is. So like what I like to call generican, the sort of generalized American, there are a ton of people who speak somewhere roughly in that, depending on how broadly you define that. Whereas when you get more specific with that definition, there's fewer people. So the old school acrolect in England was RP, received pronunciation, standard British. So that sort of old school way of speaking along this line right here. So that way of speaking used to be an acrolect, and I would argue that it's no longer an acrolect. In fact, some people will make fun of it. Probably always did make fun of it. People should be made fun of. So please make fun of me. Comments below. So the acrolect can change because it may actually become a little bit less desirable. And so really now, like modern RP, if we can think of that as the acrolect, maybe, is a little bit more in the land of estuary. So it's a bit more along this line. So it's not quite going all the way to here. It's going a little bit more like this. So someone speaking more in this way, which you will hear more now, is sometimes looked at as more of an acrolect. Now, that's not true for everyone. Not everybody would necessarily identify that as desirable. Basilects are often looked at as undesirable, even by the people who speak that way. However, sometimes they're looked at as desirable because people go, look, this is my identity, this is who I am, this is a part of my identity, a part of who I am, and I take pride in it. So that's why some of these basilects actually are the desirable accent, and it depends on the individual and the situations. People tend to do some degree of code switching where they move around a little bit on the continuum of accents. And that continuum tends to go from something closer to a basilect to something closer to their sense of an acrolect. And then we are in mesolect land, which is in that land in between, which estuary sort of falls into that. Or you could say that somebody with a light version of an accent, a more light Texas accent, would be in mesolect land. In general, when I'm working on accents, I love getting recordings of people who are in mesolect land. I love getting recordings of people who are in Basilect land, who have very, very strong versions of that more localized, culturally specific, those different elements of that accent that are very strong. I love those because that's really where I want to base a lot of my work, because that's where the Mesolect comes from. And I do think that it's useful for actors to work towards the really strong version of the accent, the more Basilect version of the accent, and then start to shift it towards the Mesolect. But if they don't go towards the Basilect, oftentimes I find people just default to something that's just a messy attempt at it. And it's less easy to go, oh, yeah, you're from there, as opposed to going, oh, you're from there, more Basilect. Or becoming like, I don't know where you're from. So getting into more generic and sort of land. So, terms that I think are useful that you don't necessarily need to remember, but that oftentimes accents are really lying somewhere on a continuum like that. I think there are other versions of this continuum because there are other influences in people's lives, but that's a simplified way of looking at it, I think. If you want to dive into accents further, you can check out, especially for actors, the materials are meant at accenthelp.com.